So today is a special day. I get to welcome you all to the first ever YH Next Gen event. With this session, we kick off a three-part education series entitled Empowering the Next Generation of Caregivers. YH Next Gen was born out of a few desires shared by its founding group. Number one, a desire to give back to our elders and the broader community, a desire for education and support as we navigate present or future roles as caregivers, and three, a desire to support and celebrate Yihong. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Yihong, allow me to give you a quick introduction. Yihong is a nonprofit senior care organization based in the GTA, and it specializes in providing culturally and linguistically appropriate care to seniors of Chinese descent, but also other backgrounds, including Vietnamese, Filipino, Korean, Japanese, and members of the South Asian community. Yihong is known mostly for its long-term care services, but it actually also provides a full continuum of care, including community-based services, home care, and even hospice palliative care. The reality, though, is Yihong faces challenges. The current wait time for one of our 805 beds is as long as 10 years. And this is compared to the provincial average of 152 days. This is only going to get worse as Canada's population ages. And with that in mind, Yihong has actually recently launched the largest fundraising goal in the Chinese Canadian community. And that's a goal of raising $80 million to build 800 new beds, doubling our capacity and meaningfully reducing our wait times. I'm one of the Capital Campaign co-chairs, so please, I invite you to reach out to me. You can reach out via the YH Next Gen email address, find me on LinkedIn, and I will happily talk to you about our campaign. But today we're focusing on YH Next Gen's mission to unite and empower the next generation of caregivers. We have three incredible panelists here with us today who've given us their time to help us get started. So first, we have Dr. Camilla Wong. We were lucky to be able to steal Dr. Wong away from her duties as a full-time geriatrician at St. Michael's Hospital. She has supported countless families through both the joys and the complexities of aging through her work at St. Mike's, also consulting for Mansung Home for the Aged, and providing geriatric outreach to remote Indigenous communities along the James Bay coast. Dr. Wong is also an associate professor at the University of Toronto and an investigator at the Li Ka-shing Knowledge Institute. And I'd like to note that Dr. Wong has incredible genes and has three grandparents all in their 90s. Next, I'd like to welcome Jane Vaughn. Jane is the Caregiver Program Manager at SE Health, which is one of the largest diversified home healthcare organizations in Canada. Jane has her master's degree in social work and has coached families through the process of aging and caring for another for over 25 years. I'm grateful to Jane for bringing her experience today on relationship dynamics in families. And last but not least, Mabel Ho. Mabel Ho wears many hats at Yihong, but one is she oversees the Caregiver Education and support services at Yihong. Mabel is a social worker as well with over 20 years of experience, and Mabel is currently pursuing her PhD in social work at the University of Toronto. Thank you, Dr. Wong, Mabel, and Jane for joining us today. And last but not least, I want to point out that we have a Q&A window at the bottom. Please don't be shy. Help me with my job of moderating today and submit your questions. You can submit anonymously. No other attendees can see, so ask whatever is on your mind. All right, let's get started. So I want to start with a question to Dr. Wong. And I want to use myself as a proxy for the attendees on today's call. So I'm 33 years old. I'm a young professional. I barely feel like there's enough time to get through my to-do list of 100 urgent items in a day. My parents are in their late 60s. They are healthy. They're quite self-sufficient. I have a great relationship with my one sister and an overall tight-knit relationship with my family. Dr. Wong, can you convince me that I should be taking the time now to speak to my parents about the future and advanced care planning?
I guess, so first of all, before beginning, thank you for organizing this, and welcome to all the attendees. I guess because this is sort of the general public audience, I want to make sure that we know what we mean by when we say advanced care planning, because that may mean different things to different people. So when you hear a healthcare provider refer to advanced care planning, it really is that process about thinking and sharing your wishes about your future health and your personal care. Most of the time, it traditionally focuses on end-of-life care, although more broadly speaking, when we talk about future planning, we may be thinking about sort of the years that lead up to that. I guess I should practice what I preach. I'm a decade older than you, Vanessa. But when I was a decade younger, I did have those conversations with my parents at that time, and I continue to do so every few years. What we know from the literature is that people who engage in advanced care planning, so discussions about end-of-life care, wishes, goals, they tend to have higher end-of-life satisfaction, but not only just the patient, but also the family as well. It also reduces the amount of time that the person will spend in hospital in their sort of final days of life. It really increases the likelihood that that person will receive what we call comfort care at home. Not to say that this is everyone's goal, but really when people have done a survey of Canadians, that's where most people wish to spend, their final days. We don't know when we're going to die. So even though you may be very busy with other priorities, again, we don't know when we're going to die or how we're going to die. So there's never a good time to have these conversations. So the sooner better than later, because, if you have these conversations during a time where things are controlled and stable, it's much better than having these difficult conversations when someone is sort of in a crisis or a new catastrophic diagnosis. There can tend to be a lot of family disagreements on what the person may want. And really, you want to focus that stage in life with being able to spend time with the family rather than arguing about what that person would want.
Thank you. So, Jane, I mentioned in my question to Camilla, like the reason of, oh, I'm too busy, that's the first that comes to mind. But in your experience, what are some of the other causes of inertia or excuses or reasons that you've heard that people don't get started now?
Well, I would actually say that one of the more common ones is that we have a tendency to think that there's always time. There'll always be time for that. We can do this later. It's too soon to do it. There's lots of time. But in reality, picking up with what Camilla said, like, we don't actually know when we're going to die or how we're going to die. So we don't really know that there is time, right? But this is often what people use. We'll put it off for another day, thinking there's always time for that later. Now, of course, that's just a form of procrastination, right? Putting it off. So I think it's helpful to look at why we procrastinate, like why we do put it off. And in my experience, I think this is not rocket science, the answer. I think it's just really hard. It's like those conversations are often emotional, whether it's expressed or not, it's felt. They're awkward. They're uncomfortable, and sometimes there's some tension and conflict that can come with it. So most of us don't willingly walk into that kind of situation, but that's what's required for these conversations, is like mustering up the courage to actually walk into some initial awkwardness and discomfort.
Absolutely. And, by the end of today's session, I really hope that people walk away with some actual tangible advice and strategies on how to approach the awkwardness and what makes it less awkward, which we will get to. But before we get there, Mabel, I'd love to hear from you. Okay, assume that we are now convinced. All the attendees can't tell me that they're not convinced. So I'm going to assume that everyone is convinced that it is important to start now. So what are, maybe name 3 questions or types of questions that we want to start with as, what should I go to my parents tomorrow and ask them in terms of the content and the information that I want to receive?
It's interesting as well as unfortunate that we talks about all kinds of things, but just not future care planning or even death and dying. Talking about future care planning can be uncomfortable as well as depressing, but it's one of the most important conversations that we will ever have with our parents. At least we learn about their wishes, their opinions, as well as their dreams. Statistics tell us that 1 in 4 Canadians aged 15 and over, and that's about 7.8 million people, are providing care to a family members or family with a long-term health condition or physical, mental disability, or problems related to aging. So it's very likely that we will become a caregiver someday, or we know a caregiver. Oftentimes, caregivers spend a lot of time looking after their family members, so we need to prepare as early as possible. Like Dr. Wong said, we do not know when we will die, but we know that we will die, we will age, and we need to be better prepared for it. And also as a caregiver, if we can better prepare to become a better caregiver, I think things might get a bit easier when the time comes. I think the 3 questions that we can ask our parents, including what they want as they age, as in like if they want to age in place, are there things we need to do like home renovations, or where do they want to go, or to the long-term care facilities? What are the options out there? So need to find out. And what about the health conditions that they have? Are they living with a particular disease, maybe arthritis, diabetes, heart disease? And do we know enough about the disease as well as what to expect as it progresses? And also about the legal and financial plannings. Do they have all the necessary documents ready, like wills, advance directive, power of attorney? And if they do we know where the documents are? So I think those are things that we need to talk about. Maybe not in one sitting, but definitely we can start the conversation somewhere and somehow.
Thank you. And actually, Dr. Wong, you mentioned, that you started having these conversations, you practice what you preach when you were in your 30s. Like, what were the questions that you asked your parents?
Yeah, I think, the reason for the 30s, it depends on what life stage you are. I think a very natural transition to having these conversations is when there's a life change. So for instance, the birth of a grandchild, right? And say, you know what, now that I'm a parent, I got to grow up. I was told I should, get my affairs in order. And I was just wondering, when you're in my stage of did you do this too? Like, for instance, I read this thing about this power of attorney. So it seems more natural, right? You're kind of doing it from this is my life stage, so I need to do this. And you probably did this, but I can't remember, right? So it makes it a little bit more natural. So I think an easier starting point, rather than just jumping right to death and dying, is really that power of attorney. And again, I'm not sure if everyone in the audience knows what that is. So that's really a legal document, at least in the province of Ontario, that says if for some reason I weren't able to make medical decisions or personal care decisions, who I would trust to help make those decisions for me. Like, who do I think would honor my wishes? Who do I think would be capable of making those decisions on my behalf? So I think that would be sort of the first question, and maybe less confrontational. It is important because we can't assume, in a family where there may be 4 siblings, that there may be harmony among the 4. Or that the spouse is automatically the person who feels most comfortable to do this, right? Maybe they don't speak English and they don't feel comfortable with navigating the healthcare system. Maybe then it makes sense to have one of the children or 2 of the children, etc. So I find that conversation is sort of a good segue conversation to the more difficult ones about death and dying. Mm-hmm. You asked for 3 questions. I hope I can take a little bit more time. Knowing that this audience is predominantly of sort of the Asian diaspora, what I do see a lot of my practice is this idea of truth telling. When someone is diagnosed with cancer, they'll say, oh, don't tell mom, don't tell grandma. The diagnosis will kill her. And it seems families make that assumption or have the superstition that somehow the delivery of bad news will expedite that person's death. And I think when someone's well, that's a valid question to ask. If you were to get really sick, I'm just curious, like, do you want to know? Because there's this tension between sort of Western culture of individual autonomy, where as healthcare providers, we feel like, oh, well, the person needs to make their own decision. They need the information to know. And yet culturally, I see this a lot in a lot of Asian cultures. Well, you can't tell mom this, it'll kill her. So having that type of conversation ahead of time with your family and say, hey, if you got really bad news about, your health, how would you like that to, do you want to know? Do you prefer to hear from the doctor or from your family? So I think that would be an important question that I would think about. And then I guess the last thing that Mabel had touched upon is not just sort of end of life care, but expectations about how care would look like as our parents get older or become more frail. Particularly in Chinese culture, there's this long tradition of family caring for the sick and dying with no questions about devotion or commitment level. And yet, in Western culture, there's sort of this tension of expectations and maybe some competing interests. And so you may want to ask, who do you expect to care for? And they'll say, well, of course you. But then you can probably lead it up to, well, can you imagine a scenario where maybe that's not possible or not desirable, right? Again, just sort of opening up that conversation.
It's incredibly helpful. Thank you. And Jane, I'd love to hear from you. It's like, we've talked about content, and Dr. Wong helped us with the suggestion of like framing it at a natural time of change in life. Do you have any other insight on how do we even start the conversation, and perhaps adding on to what some resistance that we can expect?
Right. I love that, dude. Like just starting with some kind of natural event in one's life, right? Becoming a parent or becoming a grandparent. The other thing I think that can be used as an entry point for a conversation is to bring a situation either you or you and your parents have experienced or witnessed, and asking them how they felt about the decisions that were made. So an example might be, you remember when Aunt May went into the hospital and she had a feeding tube? What do you think about that? What's your opinion of that? In my experience, people do already have opinions about these things. They're not talked about, right, or necessarily put on paper, but people actually have a strong sense of their preferences, of their wishes. It's about moving it from their heads to other people's heads and perhaps on paper. So if you give a scenario situation, I think they'll quickly give you what their opinion is. So that can be like another entry point, I think. And I think it's also helpful to, I'm always about the emotions, but I think it's important to acknowledge in those initial conversations just how awkward it is and how uncomfortable it is. Like, I really don't want to feel uncomfortable bringing this up, whatever your own language is, but to say, but I think it's too important to avoid, right? So why you're actually bringing it up. There's some basic kind of communication 101 things like using I statements, right? Rather than kind of wagging a finger and saying, well, you need to do some planning and you should do this, Those kinds of statements, I think across all cultures tend to invite resistance, right? Because they're kind of controlling statements. So if you speak for yourself, like what's your intention? What's your motivation? Why are you bringing this up? And I think finally, I would just say generally, imagine what this is like for your parents, like to have this conversation and think about these and facing these issues. You're all facing the issues. But if you can imagine what it's like for them, because really all of life's big issues are embedded in this, right? Like the body, change, independence, loss of independence, aging, loss, grieving, death, dying. Those are all life's big issues and they're embedded in that. And that's what you're raising. So bringing I'd say like a compassionate, sensitive approach to what the impact of having these discussions is.
Definitely. And I don't know if you have any examples or stories about when you've coached a family through like dealing with a challenge from the parents, like specific resistance from parents and what you counseled them on, like just an example perhaps. And I can come back to you.
I think what often comes up in the context for, of my work is that the the kids, the siblings together think the parents need some help, and the parents say, no, we don't need any help. Right? It's like, so that's a fairly common one that we have to, that we have to help caregivers with. And again, it's like taking all those things I already said, imagining what it's like for them, and to make sure that you have those conversations early on, like, both Camilla and Mabel have been talking about, like, if you have the things are well, then it's more likely to be a fruitful conversation as opposed to having it when people are in a crisis. But if you can really kind of step inside their shoes and imagine what it's like, and putting that out there, I think that can help move the conversation forward.
So we have a question from the audience. And this person has said that they found that bringing up the topic is manageable. And yeah, we can anticipate certain resistance. But what happens, I don't know if you've ever seen where parents say, I'm telling you I'm fine. I don't want to talk about it. Don't bring it up. Have you ever come across that situation?
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure we all have, right? And I think, what, the bottom line is you need to respect that. And I think you need to look at it as a process. This is a series of conversations, not one conversation. So you start off, you've brought it up, there's been resistance, you back off, right? And then you try again when maybe another situation or life event comes, and you try again. But you have to respect the no, or else you're going to have more no's down the road, I think.
And I think your suggestion about just finding, what do you think about so-and-so? So you're not making it about the parent anymore, but you're getting their opinion via commentary on another situation.
Yeah, a little more distance from it.
That's really helpful. Okay, I want to go to Mabel now. So Mabel, you've worked with many seniors and their families, particularly stroke patients and dementia patients. Can you speak to us about some of the major points of conflict you've seen when such a crisis arises? So, one of the keys, I think, to talking now is you do it before a crisis, because it's the last thing you need in a crisis scenario when a parent or a grandparent has had a stroke is to start figuring out and guessing what that person wants. Can you speak to some of those like common things that people fight about when, say, a family member has had a stroke?
And honestly, we can't predict how we age, but we can definitely prepare for our long-term care. Recently, there is a study about people's attitudes and behaviors towards planning for their future and personal health care. Most people think that is important, advanced care planning. We should do that, but only a few did that. So 8 in 10 people have given some thoughts about it, but less than 1 in 5 people actually had a plan about it. Unfortunately.
Oh, Mabel, you went on mute.
Oh,
you're back. We can hear you.
I'm back, sure. Rarely do I talk to people who want to talk about their future care planning, but rather I often talk to people when they're in crisis. When they're under tremendous stress, to make quick decisions with little time and little information. So oftentimes it's because that conversation never happened. Just give you an example. Maybe a gentleman was recently diagnosed with a terminal illness and was not able to make decisions because his condition really progresses. So the doctor asked the family about his wishes, but his wife and daughter had no idea because they never talks about it. So oftentimes we might have different ideas in terms of care provision, living arrangement, or even end-of-life decisions. So if we can have that kind of conversations about the wishes, about the plans, or even about the dreams as we age, then that would definitely save a lot of troubles in the future. And we can respect the person in terms of their wishes, and it will be less difficult for the family to make decisions when there is no time, or when they have to make that critical decisions when something happened. So by talking about future care planning, we can really plan ahead and share what matters to us. But we need to take the time. We talks about it. We can't really like sitting in a boardroom and now we're going to talk about future care planning and end of life decisions, but it should come naturally. And we probably need to test the water about a little bit as well. So we will see how comfortable our parents are. So if they're open to the idea, let's talk about it. If not, we will talk about it at another time. So if we talk about it, I guess we will save a lot of troubles down the road.
Thank you. And Dr. Wong, you're in the hospital, and I imagine you see people in their ultimate crisis points. Obviously, it's tough to talk about, but I'm sure you've seen perhaps like families fighting at the hospitals, right? Like, I don't know if you have a story you want to share about what you saw, and if you could have like pressed pause and rewound, like what you would have hoped that you could have changed for that family to avoid this like fight at a hospital when, they go in and discover their parents has had a sudden heart attack or something.
Yeah, it's very challenging. I mean, in terms of family dynamics, you really don't know where the family is sort of coming from prior to the illness, right? Oftentimes there may already be strained relationships within the family. Sometimes it's the crisis that actually puts the strain, and they were once a very cohesive family. I guess going back to your example, Vanessa, right now you have I hope that you continue to have a very harmonious relationship with your family, and that's all the more important why the conversation should be had now as opposed to in a crisis. Sometimes, some other, I know some audience members ask, like, how do you even, this seems very high level, like, how do you even start that conversation? You could put a spin on it and say, not so much on death and dying, but, sort of ask, what makes life meaningful for you, right? Like, at this stage in life, like now you just heard that you're very sick or you have this new diagnosis, like what's actually really important to you at this stage of life, right? And it could be very things that are very concrete. I actually just really want to spend as much time as I can with my grandkids. Okay, well, that's a very tangible, like that's a very sort of workable goal, and you sort of frame all decisions with that goal in mind. Other ways you can think about it is like, what worries you the most about the future, right? So again, you're not really talking about death and dying, but you're kind of getting an idea of what's important, and would, interventions like CPR really be congruent with what they just said would be most meaningful to them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's usually how I try to sort of spin that conversation when there's a lot of sort of tension is, what actually made Dad's life meaningful?
Right.
Right. And is that something that still can be achievable now? And if so, what would be the plan to execute that?
Right. It's a great overarching umbrella because at the end of the day, you can't anticipate everything, but if you have that kind of guiding principle, I imagine that's extremely helpful. Another question from the audience. Thank you, audience. Keep them coming. So this person wants to talk about siblings and really family dynamics amongst siblings. So, what happens when you have multiple children in different parts of the world who have different ideas? Jane, maybe you can take a stab at this question. What are some effective strategies you've seen with multi-children families who have different ideas?
Right. Well, certainly technology helps these days, right? When you're across the world, that can help. You could literally have a family meeting, right? Using technology to do that. The siblings one, it can be quite challenging. I mean, you can't expect siblings to be on the same page. I know that Camilla was mentioning this, they're not necessarily harmonious, and there can be strains in the relationships. So I think it's good to start off with not having that expectation. You can build some common ground, but don't expect it right up the offset, or else you'll be into arguments right at the front end of things, I think. How to avoid and resolve some kind of conflicts or potential conflicts. I think it's about trying to keep razor focused on the aging parents and their needs. Like, I think literally each and every conversation should begin and end with what is in the best interest of mom and dad, or mom or dad. Now, as we've been talking about, of course, that would be an easy answer if you had that conversation with mom and dad, and you don't all have to guess or speculate about that, right? But keeping very focused on the age, that provides like a common ground for the siblings to work from, and moves away from other issues, right, that can get them into some trouble. I think it's also valuable to really stick to the facts per se, like when you're having a conversation, what do you know? Like, what is the relevant medical information? Eh? Like, what are the facts? Not again, conjectures or ideas, but what do we know for sure? Even in terms of things like costs of things. What are the price lists? What are the costs attached to certain things? I also think that this might sound kind of bizarre, but it's good to start initially meet in a kind of a neutral location. If you do it with the technology, of course, that becomes the neutral location, because you want to really try and eliminate kind of power dynamics between the siblings as best you can. I say as best you can, because you're not likely to completely eliminate them, right? I think also siblings need to be as transparent as possible with everything they're doing and why they're doing it, right? And that helps to remove any potential suspicions, like, why are you taking mom and dad to the bank? What were you doing at the bank? Like these suspicions come in, right? And the more transparent you are, then the less likely you're even going to have to address that. The other thing is that it also prevents anyone feeling out of the loop, right? Because there's often in families, there's often one sibling thinks, well, I didn't know what was going on. Nobody tells me. It's just like, if you're transparent with everything at the front end, that again eliminates that. And another thing is, I think, is to encourage all sibling, and then each one would have this responsibility, I think, to be mindful and aware of their role in the family dynamic. So that's really kind of calling for some self-reflection and self-awareness. And that can go a long way. Now, sometimes I've had people say to me, well, I don't have a clue. I don't know what my role is. I don't know how it is. And my suggestion is always, well, you know what? Go to your partner or spouse or close friend who's been witness to your family, to being together. And chances are they're going to be able to tell you fairly quickly what your role is and what that dynamic is and how you're playing into that. So having that kind of awareness means that you can then kind of avoid some blind spots that you might have, or ways in which you might be blocking positivity and working positively with your siblings. And I think finally, the only thing I would say is that I think it's important to know that caring is rarely equally shared between siblings. I know that people really want it, it's not fair, it needs to be all of us equally, and it rarely is. There's usually one primary caregiver. And if you know that and accept that, then it's not that you don't advocate for all siblings being involved and contributing, but know that it's unlikely to be equally shared. And there are lots of ways siblings can contribute, right? And they all actually count.
Right.
That's kind of a long answer to your question.
No, that was amazing. And I wanted to keep going on the sibling dynamics. And someone asked, any thoughts on how to navigate the eldest sibling knows best mentality that is quite common in Asian families? I see Mabel and Dr. Wong reacting to that. So maybe I'll throw it over to one of you two.
I would say that families would have their dynamics. I'm the youngest of the family, so usually nobody listens to me. But I guess we can talk about it. And I think coming to this session is definitely a very good step. And I think this is actually a very good talking point. Maybe you can talk to your parents or your families about attending one of these workshops, and we can talk about it. I think it is all about conversations, it's all about discussions, it's all about getting to know about each other's thoughts on different things. I just want to share that recently I want to see that movie about a father and a daughter. The father has dementia. You probably know which movie I'm talking about.
Anthony Hopkins, right?
Yes, yeah. The father. So I got the copy of that DVD and I thought that I'm going to watch that. And I didn't know that my family would love to watch that too. So well, we got a family movie night on the father. So after that, we can talk about dementia care, and long-term care a plan in the future. So sometimes you just can't expect that, but we need to talk about it sooner than later.
And I guess another question, this has piqued a lot of people's interest. What about siblings with strained relationships, other than, what we've talked about in terms of parent, family, we should focus on the parents and like just being transparent. Any specific experiences where two siblings who perhaps don't usually talk to each other have come together and you've counseled them in coming together?
They'll probably come together at some point. Whether or not they agree is another matter. But again, all the more important before there's sort of that critical illness is the parents are probably very well aware of what the dynamics are between the siblings. And because of that, we'll already have certain expectations and preferences of which siblings should handle which matters pertaining either to their finances or their personal care. So that's part of the conversation. And I love what Jane said, is like, have no expectation that anything's going to be divided equally. Everyone also has their different strengths. Right. And caregiving has so many different aspects. There's the emotional part, there's the task doer, like the task oriented scheduler person. And then this person who's just really good with money. Right. And asking the parent, well, OK, so, me and my brother, sister, or whatever, don't really get along, but we both love you. Right. And again, bringing it back to one thing we agree on is we love you a lot. OK. And we want to be able to show our love. So why don't you tell us, like, what are each of us probably better at doing?
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. And really dividing, caregiver is not one role. There's probably 30 different tasks that people can just divide out and really allocate to people's strengths. Okay, so I wanted to go back to the topic about cultural superstitions. I think that's a really interesting one. We talked about the one where if you tell someone they're sick, then it's just going to make them sicker. Or we don't talk about death because then death might happen. Any other cultural superstitions or taboo topics that you've encountered that we haven't already talked about that people might should expect to encounter? Or if those are the main ones, that's okay too.
I mean, I think it's not so much taboo, but the sort of unstated expectation that the aging parent will be cared for by the children, right? And not necessarily in a long-term care facility. So I think that's sort of a taboo. Like, again, I think it dates back to Asian culture, where there's a long history and tradition of intergenerational households where family cares for the sick and dying with no questions about devotion or commitment. But the way things are structured in Western society, people live in nuclear families, and there's sort of that mismatch between expectations. So that's sort of the other one to prepare for. And the way I really just frame it again is, who do you expect to care for? And just Preston, like, can you imagine a scenario where you don't think that would be a good idea? Like, where you think I might not be good at that, or where that just wouldn't be desirable?
And actually, Mabel, one of the audience members have asked about other resources. So your suggestion, just to propose family movie night with the father, that's a very easy and doable one. Any other good resources, either that can help get the conversation started, or resources of who can be brought in to help, or just information that you can provide?
Right. So I think movie night is actually a good idea, as well as talking about what you attend today, these sessions, and what you heard, and maybe we can talk about it. And also, there are lots of information on YouTube as well as on the internet about future care planning. So there are actually advanced care planning workbook that you can maybe share with your parents to see, oh, have you seen something like that? Or we can go through the workbook together. So you can actually get a copy of that at the advancedcareplanning.ca, or you can find lots of information at the Advocacy Center for the Elderly as well. And I would tell you that Caregiver Education and Support Services at EHON, we have lots of educational workshops on this topic, as well as support groups. You can come and talk to other people, other caregivers who might have had some different experience that they can share with you. So there are lots of people out there You don't have to do with all this alone. But again, it's always good to talk about it sooner than later, or even not talk about it. So you will gather as much information along the way as possible. So when the time comes, you will have some information to make some informed decision.
Great. And yeah, if you send those resources to me, I can share them out to all the attendees.
Sorry, I just want to chime in. I want to give an extra plug to the advancedcareplanning.ca, or you can Google Speak Up Canada or Speak Up Ontario. That's the advanced care planning campaign. But it actually has like conversation starters, like one-liners of how to start that conversation. And then I guess the other resource that's worth knowing, in addition to like Yihong specific ones, there's also the Ontario Caregiver Organization. So if you Google that, it also has a lot of resources as well as groups and things like that as well.
Amazing. Another question about like family specific challenges. What if parents are skeptical of healthcare professionals? Like a father who does not like going to the doctor or is skeptical of doctors in general. How could someone address that and plan for that?
I mean, I think that's actually a really important care preference, right? So that already tells you that this person has sort of a lifelong sort of view of healthcare, like that they probably don't want a lot of interaction with doctors and healthcare professionals or the hospital environment, right? So you may want to start the conversation. So what makes you scared about, going to the doctor, or what makes you scared? What scares you most about your future health? And the way I'm interpreting that is, you don't really want to you don't like even taking medications, right? So, again, I was at this workshop today and I was asked to talk about, I was told I should talk about death and dying. Like, I'm just going to assume, because you don't take medications, you don't like doctors, if something bad were to happen, you'd probably just want to be at home and let nature be, right? And I'm just going on a hunch here. So using that sort of understanding of their hesitancy to, utilize healthcare as actually a starting point, and also as an information point as to how they probably don't want very invasive intervention should and when they get very sick.
I think that in addition to that, I'm just thinking that also that sometimes the kids then can also offer to step up and be an advocate. And it's like, would it be helpful to you for me to attend these appointments when you have to go, right? And what role do you want me to play? Like, do you want me to speak for you, or do you want to speak for yourself and then I just speak up at a certain time? Actually have that discussion before you go. There may be a role for them to advocate, because it's going to be pretty hard to avoid the medical professionals completely.
Right, and that's a great suggestion. And okay, this is a question for all of you. In your 20 plus years of experience, seeing the most well-prepared families, what is still commonly overlooked?
Not so commonly overlooked, but I think there's only so much you can prepare for, this concept of ambiguous loss. So that's like knowing that your loved one's going to die, but it's that process in between. Where, especially if someone's living with dementia, like they're physically present, but they're not kind of emotionally or mentally there. And I don't think I'm saying I'm guilty as a physician. I don't prepare my patients and families well enough for that process. That there's actually sort of 2 stages of grieving. And also that transition of becoming a caregiver, right? We often think of our parents as the one we go to seek guidance when we don't know what we're doing. And then all of a sudden we're having to maybe take over some of the finances or the day-to-day care, and that transition or that role transition is what I think a lot of people are not necessarily prepared for, but kind of just learn on the job.
I would say that, yeah, you can only be so prepared. That's one thing, but I think that what tends to not be given quite enough attention is just how emotional a journey this is. Again, whether it's expressed or not, those emotions are going to be really driving a lot of the actions and behaviors. I mean, these are, I think I've mentioned this already, these are all life's big issues. And there's often then a lot of attendant intense emotions that come with that. And if that whole journey and that planning journey and the caregiving journey is held that way, then for both the person receiving the care and the person giving the care, then I think that it kind of creates the space for family members to kind of cut each other some slack, maybe sometimes, or I would say like bring some grace to the whole situation or situations. Just holding it as an emotional one, and what's hard for one in one moment might be okay for another, and then it'd be different for, depending on what's coming up for respective family members.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking, so we are trying to prepare for the worst. What if we can do something earlier? We can support them to lead an active and healthy lifestyle, to prevent chronic diseases, so that we can walk alongside with them, so that we can age well together. And wouldn't that be lovely? So I guess the support is always there. So just spend time with your parents, live in the moment, appreciate what you have, and we'll age well together, whatever that journey is. And we will talk about it as needed.
Thanks, Mabel. That's something we kind of overlook. We don't always have to plan for the worst. We can start also just planning for the best too now. Dr. Wong, I'm going to ask you a question. So, you have mentioned that in your 30s, you started talking, 40s. Has there been a change in your relationship from the 20s, 30s, 40s that you've seen that we haven't maybe talked about? Like, we've talked about how relationships can change in general, but just wondering from your personal experience, if you can share any types of changes that you've seen that could help us anticipate things.
Yeah, I think it's also important to acknowledge that our parents' wishes may change as they age. Right? That nothing is stagnant, right? You actually, even though we talk about advanced care planning, is like, what would I want in my future healthcare? The irony is sometimes you actually don't know what your future self will want until you're in that situation, or until you've had a certain life experience that informs that. So, in your intro to me, you mentioned that I'm still very grateful to have 3 grandparents in their 90s, which means my parents who are in their 70s are caregivers for parents in their 90s.
Right.
And so I have seen, because of that, in the last 10 years, some of their changes in what they express would be their care preferences for when their time comes to live with frailty. So I think that's important to keep in mind, is that, this is why it's a continuous conversation. It's not a one-time thing. And don't feel like you need to touch all the topics in that one-time conversation. And with any sort of major diagnoses or life change event, that's a good time to revisit those preferences and values.
Thank you. And we've probably talked a lot about this, but if each of you could leave us with one, lasting piece of advice, or something that you would have told yourself, call it, when you were in our situation, is there anything we haven't yet talked about? And while you're thinking, I can also pause to see if there's any last minute audience questions that we can cover in our last few minutes together. And I'll also scroll through too.
Yeah, I think maybe not so much for the younger audience here, but maybe for your future selves, is don't be too hard on yourself, right? People place a lot of expectations because they love their parents so much, unconditionally, right? And they want to do what's best. And sometimes doing what's best is not necessarily what's feasible.
Right.
And so cutting yourself a little bit of slack and saying, I've tried, this is the best that I can do. And that's what matters, right? It's not, if it's not attainable, that's okay, right? It's the intent. And then again, also knowing that you don't need to do this alone, that there is, for instance, the help of the physician, the social worker, the home care worker. There is, a whole care team that can support you through those transitions.
Actually, Jane, do you mind if I jump in just with Dr. Wong, just
Yes,
to
of
follow
course.
up? You mentioned, there are people that can help you. I don't know that I would know how to even find a social worker. And I imagine that other people might have the same question. So where does someone even start? Is that through your family physician? Like, how do you find a social worker to help you? And what can they help with?
Yeah, so I guess from the physician perspective, is if there's been sort of a new diagnosis of cancer, for instance, right? It would probably be a good natural lead to have an advanced care planning discussion facilitated by the physician who's sort of responsible for that diagnosis, because those pieces of information, the more medical pieces of information, may be important for that decision making. And then from there, a referral can be made to either a social worker through home care or other community organizations, depending on geographically where you live. But maybe I'll also defer to Mabel and Jane for other avenues to access social work who are experienced in facilitating these types of conversations.
Well, I mean, home care can be one sort of way to access, I think, and also some of the resources that were already mentioned, like the Ontario Caregiver Organization, for example. They have sort of counseling support for caregivers at Liz at SE Health. They have caregiver coaches, you know, many of whom are social workers. And I think it's drawing on those caregiving resources to start with.
I just want to share a number with you all. We have information and referral services number here at EHON. So it's 416-412-4570. So make sure that I got it right. So it's 416-412-4570. And our social workers will be happy to help. So we'll provide information and referral services to the community. So if you need to find one of us, give us a call.
Thank you. Jane, I had cut you off on something that you wanted to add after. You're good? Okay. I have another question from an attendee. So if someone is already in a frail situation, cognitive function loss, how can you start this conversation knowing that they are immediately looking to make some of the tough decisions? And perhaps I'll also add to that, like knowing that depending on the stage of their cognitive function loss, that they might not have the capacity to be answering for themselves.
Yeah, that's always a challenging one, right? Again, sort of a plug into why having the conversations when someone is healthy and able to is so important. But, you know, in the scenario where, and this is what I see a lot as a geriatrician, when someone is living with more moderate stages of dementia, may not be able to fully engage in very deep conversations about values and wishes, is to really draw on family members and their experiences with that person in other life situations. And then to best put together, okay, well, this is sort of the consistency of how this person has interacted with other disease states or other challenges in their life. So this is what we can sort of extrapolate as to what they would want if they were able to speak for themselves right now. Mm-hmm. So you're really drawing on previous experience in that circumstance.
Right. This is a great question. Are there any good resources for people that might be single without immediate family members that can care for them? And they have siblings who are also aging? Or would, I guess, at the same place, like, so we've been talking about family and relying on your family, but if you don't have family, where can you turn? Would it be the same channels of speaking to your physician and kind of triggering that social work support system? Yeah,
so it depends on what the care needs are. So I'm an only child. Obviously, if there's extended family, that would be a good resource. But in the absence of that, it depends on what the care needs are. If they're more sort of physical care needs, then what's known as the LIN, or the home and community care services. There are personal support workers that can help with things like, you know, bathing and dressing. So very sort of heavy personal care. Mm-hmm. If we're thinking more things like, you know, cooking and shopping, those things can also be hired separately, or, you know, also through home and community care. There are various community agencies that can provide these type of services.
And actually, you've teed me up well to plug our next session, which is in August, so August 11th. And we'll be speaking about what are the services out there, like along the whole continuum of care, from healthy aging to palliative. So for those of you on this that are interested, you'll get your questions answered next session. So I think with that, you know, we might wrap up there. If you have any attendees, quickly type your question if there's any last minute question. If not, I will thank Mabel and Dr. Wong and Jane for your time. I've already received so many messages saying that it was extremely helpful. And this will be recorded, so attendees, maybe after the father, you guys can watch this recording together, share it with your family. And I also wanted to thank all the attendees for their time today. All right. Okay, we'll sign off now and have a great day, everyone, and enjoy your summer. Have a safe summer.
Bye-bye.
Bye.